My husband secretly invited his sister on our honeymoon despite my objections. When I found out, I left him at the airport and decided to take the trip on my own. Hi, so my husband Jacob, 30 meters, and I, 27F, got married about a week ago. Yesterday, we were supposed to leave for our honeymoon, but I ended up taking a flight to a different destination altogether because his younger sister showed up at the airport. Apparently, Jacob had secretly invited her to come along with us. For some background, his sister Angie, 26F, recently went through a devastating divorce. She had been married to her high school sweetheart, and they had spent several happy years together. About a year ago, Angie discovered that her husband had been having an affair with a coworker. Despite her efforts to reconcile and multiple marriage counseling sessions, her husband decided to file for divorce, claiming he couldn't continue the marriage. Angie was heartbroken and begged him to stay, but he left, and they ended up getting divorced. Although she received a substantial settlement, including the house and cars, none of it mattered to her because she wanted to keep her marriage intact. I felt genuinely sorry for Angie. She was a sweet person who didn't deserve the pain she'd gone through. No one should have to endure such betrayal, and I had seen how deeply it had affected her. I wanted to help, offering only words of comfort and support. I even thought about including her in the wedding preparations to keep her busy and distracted, but Jacob advised against it, saying that being part of our wedding might remind her too much of her own heartbreak. He had a point, so I decided to check in on her occasionally instead. Angie and I weren't close, but we got along well. That was pretty much the case with most of Jacob's family. I wouldn't say I was particularly close to any of them, but I had never had any issues with them either. However, the day after our wedding, my mother-in-law, Nora, 55F, called and suggested that Angie join us on our honeymoon. Jacob and I had been planning this trip for a long time, and honestly, I was more excited about the honeymoon than the wedding itself. I love traveling, and so does Jacob. We're particularly passionate about exploring mountain ranges, which is why we had a whole tour of the Alps planned. We'd taken 3 weeks off work and had been eagerly anticipating this trip ever since we planned it. While I felt for Angie and was willing to do anything to cheer her up, this was a different matter. Nora mentioned that Angie also loved traveling and thought the trip might help her cope with the pain. She insisted that Angie wouldn't come unless I personally invited her and made it seem like I wanted her to join us. Honestly, I didn't want Angie to come along. This was supposed to be our honeymoon, and I didn't think it was appropriate for family to join the newlyweds on their honeymoon. Moreover, I had been looking forward to this trip for months, especially since the weeks leading up to the wedding had been incredibly busy for both of us. Jacob and I had taken time off specifically to spend quality time together. It didn't seem fair for Nora to ask me to sacrifice that for Angie's sake. With a heavy heart, I explained to Nora that I couldn't invite Angie because it wouldn't be fair to either of us. I hoped she would understand that this was our special time and that I didn't want Angie to join us. Nora didn't argue at the time, but she persisted in convincing me that inviting Angie could be incredibly beneficial for her, suggesting that I would be doing everyone a huge favor by including her. She offered to cover all of Angie's travel expenses so I wouldn't have to worry about the cost. She pushed hard, but I stood my ground and firmly declined. It wasn't fair to either of us. While I understood that Angie was struggling with her divorce, it wasn't right for her to join us and expect us to sacrifice our honeymoon just to help her feel better. Moreover, it wasn't even Angie who was pushing for this, it was Nora. Angie hadn't approached me about wanting to come along. When I mentioned the honeymoon to her, she simply told me to have fun and showed no interest in joining us. If Angie had expressed a desire to come, I might have considered it, but she hadn't. After a heated discussion, Nora finally dropped the topic, and it didn't come up again. I then spoke to Jacob about what his mother had suggested, but he seemed oddly indifferent. He just asked what I had told her, and when I said I had refused, he merely grunted, and that was the end of it. No further conversation. In hindsight, I probably should have read more into his reaction, but at the time, I was too excited about packing for our honeymoon to give it much thought. The week between our wedding and the honeymoon was hectic as we wrapped up work commitments. We didn't have the chance to see anyone from his family, and no one reached out to us. Jacob and I occasionally talked about the honeymoon while at home, but he never mentioned any plans involving Angie until the very last moment. It wasn't until we were at the airport that I found out he had secretly invited Angie to join us, with Nora's help. Yesterday, Jacob and I left for the airport about 3 hours before our flight was scheduled to depart. As we were outside, taking our bags out of the cabs, I suddenly saw Angie and Nora approaching us. I tried to stay open-minded until I noticed that Angie had her bags with her. It was then clear that she wasn't just there to say goodbye or drop us off. She shouted surprise and hugged me as she got closer. I was still trying to process what was happening because I had been very clear with both Jacob and his mother about my feelings on this. Yet there she was, seemingly ready to join us on our honeymoon. When Angie saw my confused and less than enthusiastic reaction, her smile faded and she asked if I was not happy to see her. I was at a loss for words, so I turned to Jacob, hoping he'd clarify things. I wanted him to tell me he had no idea about this and that Nora was behind it, but instead he admitted that after I had told him about the phone call and our conversation with Nora, he had thought it might be a good idea for Angie to come along to help her distract herself and have a good time. The reason Jacob hadn't reacted that day was because, a couple of hours after our conversation, he had gone behind my back and told Angie that I had suggested the idea of her joining us on the trip to surprise me. He was right about one thing. I was definitely surprised, but not in a good way. I found it sneaky and selfish of him to go against my wishes. I like Angie, she's a nice person, and I get along with her, but I like many people. I'm not going to take everyone with me on my honeymoon just because it would be a nice thing to do. I don't feel obligated to do something just because it's a kind gesture, especially when it comes to something as intimate and special as a honeymoon. When Jacob told me that this was his idea and that he had invited Angie, I snapped at him right there in front of Angie and his mother. I told him that this was completely unacceptable. I was aware that Angie would feel bad about it, but that wasn't my primary concern at that moment. I told him he had gone behind my back, and I couldn't forgive him for that. It had barely been a week into our marriage, and he was already being deceitful and lying to me. He tried to downplay it as something small and insignificant, but I had made it very clear to him that I had been looking forward to this honeymoon for a long time. Even when I told him about Nora's suggestion and how I didn't like the idea of inviting Angie just because she was feeling depressed, I had been very explicit about my feelings. This was not petty or insignificant to me. I felt deeply betrayed and was extremely upset, but he refused to see it that way. He insisted I was making a bigger deal out of it than necessary and blowing it out of proportion. He told me that Angie would cover her own expenses, stay in a separate room, and only join us for certain activities, so we wouldn't be together all the time. But that wasn't enough for me because at the end of the day she was still accompanying us on our honeymoon. And to me, that felt weird. If it had been any other trip, like a regular weekend getaway, I don't think I would have had a problem. But inviting my sister-in-law to join us on our honeymoon was where I drew the line. After some arguing, I decided I had had enough. Since Jacob refused to take responsibility and accept that he had done something wrong, I made up my mind to leave and go on the trip alone. I decided I was better off going on my own. I had already taken 3 weeks off from work, and I wasn't going to let that time go to waste. I dropped the argument and headed into the airport, telling Jacob not to follow me. Of course, he did follow. But I didn't want him near me at that moment, so I had to shout at him to stop and told him I didn't want him anywhere near me or I would report him for harassment. That got him to back off, though I could see he was really upset and hurt by my words. I didn't care, I was furious and just wanted to get away from him. After making it clear I didn't want him around, I bought a ticket and caught the next flight to Miami. I was lucky, it didn't take long to board, and I was on the plane before Jacob even had a chance to change his mind about following me. Once I landed in Miami, I turned on my phone to check for messages. My inbox was flooded with texts from Jacob, Angie, and Nora, all of them apologetic for what had happened. However, Angie's message stood out the most. She told me that when Jacob had visited her a few days earlier, he had claimed I suggested she join us on the honeymoon. She said she was about to ask me if I was really okay with it because she didn't want to intrude, but Jacob insisted she shouldn't ask me, wanting it to be a surprise. He had made it sound like this was my idea. After our fight at the airport, it became clear to Angie that this was all orchestrated by her mother and brother. She apologized on their behalf, acknowledging that their actions were foolish. She didn't blame me for my reaction, saying she would likely have done the same if she were in my place. Her apology seemed genuine, and I assured her that it was okay. I understood she was going through a tough time and wasn't involved in their plan, so I forgave her. But with Jacob and Nora, it was a different story. Jacob was apologizing, but he was also trying to make me out to be the bad guy, and Nora was doing the same. They were pushing the narrative that they only had good intentions and didn't anticipate my reaction. They claimed they believed I would eventually accept it because I always seemed to like Angie, which is true. I do like her. But that doesn't mean I wanted her to join us on our honeymoon. If they can't accept that, I don't know what else to say. I'm certain I'm not in the wrong here, but I still feel a pang of guilt, especially since I've been arguing with Jacob nonstop since I arrived. He just won't admit that he messed up by going behind my back and that this was not the right thing to do. I respect that he loves his family and is willing to make sacrifices for them, but it feels incredibly unfair to expect me to make the same sacrifices for his family. I'm his family now too, and he owes me certain considerations. It feels like my happiness doesn't hold as much value to him as his family's does, and while it feels petty to frame it as a competition, that's how it seems. If he truly valued my happiness as much as he values his sister's, maybe he wouldn't have gone behind my back and done the one thing I explicitly asked him not to. We've been fighting a lot, and it's been really tough, especially since we've just been married for a week and have already hit such a rough patch. We've been together for almost 7 years, and I feel awful because something like this has never happened before. Our relationship has always been relatively normal, with the usual ups and downs, but nothing of this magnitude, and I just don't know how to handle it. Jacob insists his intentions were good and that I need to understand that. He says that while having Angie join us on the honeymoon wouldn't have ruined it for me, it would have meant a lot to her and might have even prevented her from getting worse down the line. I can't explain to him that having Angie with us would have ruined the honeymoon for me without sounding like a terrible person or a wife who wants to keep her husband away from his family. But I promise that's not the case. Logically, I know I'm not the bad guy here, but all the fighting has made me feel like I'm losing my mind and I have no idea how to move forward. I feel terrible for leaving my husband at the airport and canceling our honeymoon when I realized he had invited his sister along without telling me. Update 1. I'm still in Miami and I've been exploring a lot. This is my first time here and many of you suggested some great spots to check out, which I've been doing to take my mind off things. I still haven't sorted things out with Jacob because he's being very stubborn. He's convinced that having Angie with us on the honeymoon wouldn't have made a difference. It took reading through all your comments for me to realize that I wasn't going crazy and that he was being unreasonable. I don't understand why he doesn't get it, especially when even Angie has acknowledged that it would have been weird. He's been texting me, but I've given up on trying to explain things to him. I've spent the last few days holed up in my hotel room, arguing with him, and I've wasted enough time trying to make him see reason. I can't help him if he refuses to see the obvious. The worst part is that I can't fully enjoy myself because I keep thinking about Jacob and what I'm going to say when I go back. I can't avoid him forever, and we're literally married, so it's not like we can just break up and be done with it. My entire existence feels heavy, and I don't know, everything just seems to be going wrong right now. I've talked to my parents about this, but they don't really know what to do either. They just advised me to do whatever I felt was right and assured me they'd support me. That's somewhat helpful, knowing they'll be on my side no matter what, but I can't shake the feeling that everything is falling apart. The fact that it's been less than a month since our wedding makes everything even harder to deal with. I know it's easy for people to tell me this is a huge red flag, and I should leave my husband, get divorced, and be done with it, but in reality, it's not that simple. I'm not even talking about the legal aspects of divorce. I'm talking about the emotional and mental toll it takes. I don't know what I'm going to do. Full disclosure, I have absolutely no idea, and I don't even know what to expect. Update 2. I returned from Miami a couple of days ago, and things haven't been great so far. When I got home, it was empty because Jacob wasn't there. I spent 3 weeks in Miami, and after about 2.5 weeks, he stopped texting me. His last few messages were insistent that he didn't have bad intentions and that I needed to reconsider my actions. When I got back, I decided to finally reach out and told him I was home. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just felt like I had to tell him because it was better than the uncertainty of not knowing what the future held. So the day I told him I was back, he texted me saying he would come over the next day so we could talk. I thought it was a good sign that we might finally make progress, but when he came over, we were still stuck on the same issues. We kept arguing about who was overreacting and who was in the wrong. He insisted that I shouldn't have reacted the way I did in front of Angie and made such a big deal out of it. He said I should have trusted him since he would never do anything to jeopardize our relationship. But the fact that I was against something as seemingly trivial as Angie joining us for our honeymoon, which was just a glorified vacation, made him feel like I was being overly sensitive and that I had no reason to act so dramatically about it. I found it really unfair. I had told him before how I felt about Angie joining us, but he completely ignored my concerns. More than Angie being on our honeymoon, I had an issue with him going behind my back and lying to me. Not only did he lie, but he also twisted things by telling Angie that it was my suggestion for her to join us. I want Angie to be happy, but not at the expense of my own happiness. I don't think it's selfish or cruel to feel that way, despite how he tried to paint it. If anything, he was the selfish one, as he couldn't be bothered to consider my feelings and only cared about being seen as the good guy for his family, not for me. It felt like he was saying I wasn't worth it, and that was a really horrible feeling. On top of everything, he's been staying in a hotel because he said he didn't leave after finding out I had taken off without him. He mentioned that after I stopped responding to his messages, he even considered filing for divorce because he thought I was taking things too far. I found this attitude completely uncalled for because he was the one who messed up. We argued a lot, and to sum things up, our situation hasn't improved at all. He keeps saying that I don't have a sibling, which is why I don't understand why this is so important to him. Maybe that's true. I'll never personally understand what it's like to have a sibling and care for them so much. But you know what? Several people in the comments of this post do have siblings, and they told me that this was going too far. So yeah, maybe he's wrong, and he's trying to gaslight me into thinking I'm the one overreacting. Whatever the case, I'm not falling for it. I've made up my mind that if he doesn't apologize soon, I might need to talk to my lawyer and prepare for a divorce. If he does apologize, that's a different story. I've been thinking about marriage counseling, but that's only if he approaches me in the next few days and apologizes for everything. Right now, it seems really unlikely that Jacob will apologize. He and Nora are the only ones who think what he did was perfectly fine, and that I'm overreacting for no reason. But Angie, the person they're defending, is actually on my side. She has reached out several times to explain to both Nora and Jacob that what they did was sneaky and just not cool. However, they're not willing to listen to her, which shows that it's more important for them to be right than to do the right thing. I honestly don't know what to think anymore because this situation is just absurd. I thought I had married a sensible and amazing man, but right now, he doesn't feel like the same person. I have a lot of conflicting feelings, and talking about it here helps me make sense of things, even if just a little. I just want a resolution to this. It's getting really tiring, and I can't keep dealing with this drama all the time. Update 3. Hi everyone, I know it's been a while since my last update. I haven't posted because the past couple of months have been incredibly tough. I decided to give our marriage another chance and suggested marriage counseling. Shortly after my last update, Jacob expressed a desire to work on our marriage and said he wasn't ready to give up. After much consideration, we agreed to try counseling, but it didn't help. During our sessions, we managed to get through them fine, but once we were outside, the arguments resumed, and it felt like we were just wasting time. We attended therapy for nearly a month, but we eventually decided to stop because it made no sense to keep pretending to work things out in therapy while continuing to fight in real life. Jacob couldn't see that his strong focus on his family was overshadowing the fact that I was his family too, and I wasn't willing to be second in my own marriage. We both agreed it was best to separate. It wasn't an easy decision, it was incredibly difficult, and we were both devastated that our marriage wasn't going to work out. We filed for divorce mutually, and now we're in a settlement phase. At this point, I just want this to be over so I can move on with my life and try to forget this ever happened. I'm considering individual therapy because I really need help processing everything that's happened. My parents and friends have been incredibly supportive, and I'm so grateful for that. They've made this whole situation a bit easier to bear. I know people are talking about me and how my marriage fell apart so quickly, but honestly, I don't care. What matters is that the people who matter to me believe I did the right thing. As long as I have their support, I'm not too worried about what comes next. I'm just going to focus on work and myself now. It's going to be a tough few months emotionally, but I know people have faced worse and come through it, and I'm hopeful for what the future holds. Thank you so much for all the love and support. It means the world to me.